The morning of June 23, 1945. A makeshift interrogation room in a damaged sugar warehouse on Okinawa. Colonel Yahida Masao, formerly Chief Intelligence Officer for the Japanese 32nd Army, sat across from an American lieutenant named Thomas Brennan, a translator for the Allied Intelligence Service. Between them lay a stack of American supply manifests captured during the final days of fighting, documents that revealed something Yahida had spent the entire war trying to deny. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Yahida's hands trembled slightly as Lieutenant Brennan slid the first document across the table. It was a routine logistics report from Service Squadron 4, listing supplies delivered via underway replenishment during the Okinawa campaign. The numbers were clinical, bureaucratic, utterly unremarkable in their presentation. Yet they represented a logistical reality so overwhelming that Yahida, a career military officer trained in precise analysis, had spent 3 months trying to convince himself the figures were impossible. 2,787,000 barrels of fuel oil, 7,126,000 gallons of aviation gasoline, 105,000 barrels of diesel. This was not total production capacity or strategic reserves. This was what one American naval squadron delivered to one battle during one 3-month campaign. Yahida looked up at Lieutenant Brennan, searching the young American's face for some indication this was psychological warfare, inflated numbers meant to demoralize defeated commanders. Brennan's expression offered no such comfort. He simply waited, patient and professional, while Yahida absorbed what the document meant. The Japanese colonel had spent 4 years tracking American capabilities through multiple intelligence channels. Agent reports from neutral countries, analysis of captured equipment, systematic interrogation of prisoners, reconnaissance photographs, and intercepted radio traffic. Every source had told the same impossible story. America operated on a scale that made Japanese industrial capacity look medieval by comparison. But Yahida, like most Japanese staff officers, had clung to the belief that American abundance was exaggerated, that surely no nation could sustain such waste, that eventually the material advantage would narrow as Japanese spiritual strength prevailed. The Okinawa campaign had shattered every one of those comforting delusions with mathematical certainty that admitted no argument. Yahida pulled another document from the stack, a captured American ammunition expenditure report from the 24th Corps, covering just the month of May, 1945. The Corps troops had dropped 521,000 60mm mortar rounds, expended 9 million rifle bullets, burned through 16 million 30 caliber machine gun rounds, and thrown 367,000 hand grenades. The United States Navy had added 600,000 rounds of naval gunfire support. These were not projections or estimates. These were actual expenditures, verified through American logistics accounting. Yahida compared the figures to Japanese ammunition allocations for the entire Okinawa defense. His forces, approximately 110,000 men defending their own territory with months to prepare, had received perhaps 1/10 the ammunition the Americans consumed in a single month of offensive operations. The disparity was not marginal, it was existential. A Japanese soldier had recorded in his diary during late April, discovered among captured documents, a simple observation that captured the material reality better than any intelligence report. I am really surprised at the amount of ammunition that the enemy has. When friendly forces fire 1 round, at least 10 rounds are guaranteed to come back. Yahida had read that diary entry weeks earlier. He had dismissed it as the exaggeration of an exhausted infantryman, the subjective impression of a man under fire who naturally overestimated enemy capabilities. But the logistics reports confirmed the soldier's observation. The Americans were not firing 10 rounds for every Japanese round. They were firing considerably more. The journey to this moment of terrible understanding had not been sudden. Yahida had watched the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory accumulate gradually, like water behind a failing dam, each new piece of intelligence adding pressure until the barrier of denial finally collapsed completely. The first cracks had appeared years earlier, but Japanese military culture and the nature of wartime reporting made recognizing the truth nearly impossible until defeat became undeniable. In December 1941, when Japan launched simultaneous attacks across the Pacific, Japanese military planners believed they understood American industrial capacity. They had studied American production figures, analyzed factory locations, assessed resource availability. The Japanese Naval General Staff had acknowledged American experts who knew every U.S. man of war and aircraft type by name, hull number, configuration, and technical characteristics. Intelligence officers believed they possessed accurate information about enemy capabilities. What they possessed was data without context, numbers without understanding of what those numbers actually meant. The fundamental Japanese miscalculation began with a correct observation that led to a catastrophically wrong conclusion. American military preparedness in 1941 was indeed limited. The United States Army ranked 18th in the world in size, smaller than Portugal's. American tanks were few in number and obsolete in design. Military aircraft production totaled fewer than 3,000 planes annually. The U.S. Navy, while substantial, was divided between two oceans and focused on coastal defense rather than power projection. Japanese planners looked at this evidence and concluded that America lacked the capacity for sustained military production. What they failed to grasp was something fundamental about American industrial structure that would prove decisive. The Great Depression had idled massive amounts of industrial infrastructure across the United States. Factories sat empty or underutilized. Millions of skilled workers remained unemployed or underemployed. Machine tools capable of producing components for automobiles, tractors, or refrigerators operated at reduced capacity or sat completely idle. What looked like economic weakness was actually enormous reserve capacity waiting to be activated. When President Franklin Roosevelt called for military mobilization, he was not asking American industry to build entirely new capability from nothing. He was asking them to convert existing factories, rehire laid-off workers, and redirect machinery that was already built, installed, and proven. The infrastructure for industrial mobilization already existed, requiring redirection rather than creation. Germany and Japan, by contrast, had been operating at near full capacity for years, steadily expanding military production with minimal unused resources to activate. For Japanese intelligence officers like Yahida, this distinction was impossible to grasp in 1941. It contradicted everything their experience and training had taught them about industrial mobilization. Building factories took years. Training workers required months. Developing production techniques demanded extensive trial and error. Yet the Americans seemed to be violating every principle of industrial expansion that Japanese experts understood. When Roosevelt announced in May 1940 that America would produce 50,000 aircraft annually as part of a massive rearmament program, then expanded this vision to include 185,000 aircraft, 120,000 tanks, 55,000 anti-aircraft guns, and 18 million tons of merchant shipping within 2 years. Japanese leadership's response was dismissive, even contemptuous. The numbers were obviously American propaganda, they concluded, designed to intimidate Japan and boost Allied morale. The assessment seemed entirely reasonable based on Japanese industrial experience. Increasing production 60-fold in 2 years violated everything Japan had learned about manufacturing expansion. The logistics of such growth appeared impossible. Raw materials had to be secured, transportation arranged, facilities constructed, workers trained, suppliers coordinated, quality controlled. Each step took time that could not be compressed beyond physical limits. Yet by 1943, as Yahida worked in Imperial General Headquarters, analyzing intelligence from across the Pacific, disturbing evidence accumulated that American production was not propaganda, but terrifying reality. Captured equipment bore serial numbers, suggesting production volumes far exceeding Japanese estimates. Prisoner interrogations consistently described American supply abundance that seemed wasteful by Japanese standards. Agent reports from neutral countries confirmed massive American factory expansion. Aerial reconnaissance photographs showed shipyards with dozens of vessels in various stages of construction. Every independent source confirmed the same basic picture. America was producing military equipment at scales Japan could not match even at maximum mobilization. The question confronting Japanese intelligence was not whether American production exceeded Japanese capabilities, but by how much, and whether Japan could sustain the war long enough for something to change the strategic balance. Yahida had participated in preparing intelligence assessments throughout 1943 and 44, compiling information about American capabilities from all available sources. The reports were professional, methodical, based on verifiable data. They compared Japanese production capacity to Allied output across every significant category of military equipment. Every comparison told the same story. America outproduced Japan in every category by significant margins, and the gap was widening rather than narrowing as the war continued. But the reports, no matter how carefully documented, were largely ignored or dismissed by senior leadership. Japanese strategic culture could not accommodate the possibility that material superiority might matter more than tactical skill or spiritual strength. The warrior tradition emphasized courage, discipline, and determination as the decisive factors in warfare. These qualities had won wars for centuries. Superior tactics, combined with fighting spirit, should overcome numerical disadvantages. Material abundance without martial virtue should lead to defeat, not victory. American forces, in Japanese perception, lacked the spiritual discipline necessary for victory. They were soft, mechanized, dependent on material comfort. They would break under pressure, retreat when supplies ran low, surrender when faced with determined resistance. Every principle of Japanese military philosophy suggested American industrial capacity was ultimately irrelevant because American soldiers lacked the will to endure hardship. The battles of 1942 and 43 had challenged these assumptions, but Japanese commanders found ways to preserve their beliefs. When American forces landed at Guadalcanal in August 1942, Japanese commanders expected to face inexperienced troops with inferior equipment who could be quickly defeated. What they encountered was something more disturbing. The Americans were indeed inexperienced initially, suffering defeats in early engagements. But something about American forces troubled experienced Japanese commanders, even as they won tactical victories. The sheer quantity of American equipment was unprecedented. American units that suffered heavy losses in battle were fully re-equipped within days, sometimes within hours. Vehicles, weapons, ammunition, supplies flowed in seemingly endless streams. Japanese units that won tactical victories found themselves unable to exploit them because American logistics simply absorbed the losses and continued operations without pause. Captured American supply dumps contained more material than entire Japanese divisions possessed. General Hitoshi Imamura, commanding the 17th Army at Rabaul, began sending increasingly concerned reports to Imperial General Headquarters. American resupply capabilities exceeded anything Japanese forces had encountered. Supply ships arrived continuously. Artillery fired at rates Japanese gunners could achieve only during carefully prepared offensives, and the Americans sustained these rates indefinitely. Every American rifle squad possessed more trucks than a Japanese infantry regiment. These reports were noted but not fully absorbed by headquarters staff in Tokyo. Imamura was known for caution, for always requesting more resources, for emphasizing difficulties over opportunities. His complaints were dismissed as the usual general's grumbling, the predictable tendency of field commanders to exaggerate enemy strength and minimize their own capabilities. Besides, Japan was still winning in most theaters during 1942. The Imperial Navy controlled vast ocean territories. Japanese armies occupied resource-rich territories across Southeast Asia. Tactical successes continued despite growing Allied material advantages. But Yahida and other intelligence analysts could not so easily dismiss what they were observing. Throughout 1943, as Allied counteroffensives gained momentum across multiple fronts, the volume of disturbing data increased exponentially. After the Solomon Islands campaigns, Japanese intelligence conducted systematic interrogation of the few prisoners who survived. The debriefing teams sought to understand not just tactical details, but broader patterns of American military capability. The stories Japanese survivors told were remarkably consistent. Every interrogated soldier described American supply abundance that defied comprehension. They spoke of meals being discarded because soldiers did not like the taste. They described vehicles being abandoned after minor mechanical problems because requisitioning new ones was easier than repairs. They recounted seeing supply dumps containing equipment in quantities that appeared unlimited. Medical supplies were available in abundance. Captured prisoners received better food as POWs than they had eaten as Japanese soldiers. Some accounts seemed so extreme that interrogators initially suspected Allied propaganda or exaggeration, but the consistency across hundreds of independent accounts made dismissal impossible. Enlisted men and officers, infantry and artillery, Navy and Army personnel all told the same stories of overwhelming American material superiority. More significantly, these accounts matched what Japanese forces were experiencing across every theater where they engaged American forces. In New Guinea, where Japanese forces fought desperately throughout 1943 and into 44, the pattern repeated with devastating clarity. American engineers built roads, airfields, and supply depots at speeds Japanese engineers considered impossible. Bulldozers and earth-moving equipment performed in hours what would have required thousands of laborers weeks to accomplish. American transport aircraft delivered supplies to forward positions faster than Japanese forces could move supplies by truck and ship. One captured Japanese commander broke down completely after watching American construction operations for several hours. He fell to his knees weeping, repeating the phrase big scoops," as he pointed at the massive earth-moving equipment. Later interrogation revealed he had commanded hundreds of prisoners and laborers who took weeks to accomplish what a single American bulldozer operator completed in a day. The knowledge that such equipment existed in abundance, that Americans brought heavy machinery to remote Pacific islands and used it casually for routine construction, shattered his understanding of warfare. The psychological impact of American logistics extended beyond captured personnel. Japanese forces defending Pacific Islands could hear American supply operations at night. The endless sound of motors, vehicles moving continuously, never stopping, never running short of fuel. Some Japanese units reported hearing phantom convoys when no vehicles were present. The psychological damage so severe that the mere expectation of American abundance created auditory hallucinations. But perhaps the most devastating intelligence for Japanese planning came not from prisoner accounts or battlefield observations, but from captured American documents. Unlike subjective impressions or second-hand reports, supply documents were clinical, bureaucratic, undeniable. They were not meant to impress or intimidate. They were simply routine paperwork, tracking supplies through the American military distribution system. And the numbers they contained represented logistical capacity that made Japanese operations look primitive by comparison. One particular document captured during operations in the Marianas proved especially revealing. A monthly supply report from an American Marine division operating on Saipan during June and July 1944. The report, stamped and signed by multiple logistics officers, listed deliveries and consumption for 2 months of offensive operations. The division consisted of approximately 22,000 men, roughly comparable in size to a Japanese division, though American divisions carried far more organic support capability. The American division had received during those 2 months supplies that exceeded what an entire Japanese army received in the same period. Fuel allocations alone were staggering. Where Japanese divisions rationed gasoline carefully, measuring consumption by the liter, American divisions consumed fuel as if supplies were infinite. The captured documents showed American forces using vehicles for tasks Japanese forces would accomplish on foot. Trucks transported water, moved small quantities of supplies, even provided transport for personnel traveling short distances. The ammunition figures were even more devastating. The American division on Saipan had received artillery ammunition at rates that would exhaust Japanese stockpiles in days. American artillery units fired support missions consuming more shells in hours than Japanese batteries received in months. This was not some special preparation for a major offensive where supplies were concentrated briefly. This was normal operating procedure, the routine monthly supply for regular combat operations. Yahida had personally analyzed these documents in Imperial General Headquarters, cross-referencing the figures with Japanese logistics reports, verifying calculations, searching desperately for errors that might make the disparity less catastrophic. He found none. The numbers were accurate, verified through multiple sources, mathematically certain. American logistics operated at levels Japanese industrial capacity could never sustain. The implications were inescapable and terrifying. If one American division consumed supplies at this rate, and the United States had dozens of divisions deployed across multiple theaters, then total American logistical capacity exceeded Japanese production by orders of magnitude, not by 2 or 3 times, which might be overcome through superior tactics and determination. By 10 or 20 times, a gap so large that no amount of courage or skill could bridge it. Yet even with this evidence accumulated and documented, even with intelligence reports submitted and briefed to senior leadership, Japanese strategic planning continued as if American material superiority could be overcome through determination and tactical excellence. The conviction that fighting spirit mattered more than factory output was so deeply embedded in Japanese military culture that no amount of evidence could dislodge it. Marshal Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet until his death in April 1943, had warned before Pearl Harbor that Japan could run wild for 6 to 12 months, but thereafter had no expectation of success if the war continued. His warning was prophetic, based on clear understanding of American industrial potential, but after his death, few senior leaders acknowledged the mathematical impossibility of Japanese victory through conventional military operations. Instead, Japanese strategy shifted toward attrition warfare, toward making American advances so costly that the United States would negotiate a settlement preserving some Japanese gains. Each island defense was designed not to achieve victory, but to inflict maximum casualties, to create doubt in American resolve, to demonstrate that final victory would require such bloodshed that compromise seemed preferable. This strategy might have possessed some logic if American casualties significantly impacted American war production or strategic planning. But Japanese intelligence assessments showed clearly that American industrial capacity was so overwhelming that battlefield losses, however severe, barely affected the flow of supplies to forward areas. The United States could absorb casualties and equipment losses that would cripple Japanese operations, while simultaneously increasing production and expanding forces. The Battle of Iwo Jima in February and March 1945 demonstrated this reality with brutal clarity. Japanese forces, under Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi, defended the island with extraordinary skill, utilizing every cave and defensive position to exact maximum American casualties. The battle lasted 36 days. American forces suffered nearly 26,000 casualties, including almost 7,000 killed. By any historical standard, these were devastating losses for capturing 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Yet, American forces never slowed. Supplies continued arriving, casualties were evacuated and replaced. Equipment losses were made good within days. More than 2,000 B-29 bombers would eventually land on Iwo Jima's airfields during the remaining months of the war, vindicating the island's strategic value. But the battle's most significant lesson was what it revealed about American capacity to absorb losses without diminishing operational capability. Yahida had studied intelligence reports from Iwo Jima with growing despair. Japanese defenders had fought with incredible courage, inflicting casualties at rates that would have stopped any previous military operation in history. Yet the Americans simply absorbed the losses and continued, their logistics unimpaired, their determination unshaken, their material advantage so overwhelming that tactical brilliance became irrelevant. And then came Okinawa, the final battle, the one that destroyed every remaining Japanese illusion about the possibility of favorable terms through determined resistance. Planning for Okinawa's defense began in late 1944. General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, understood he could not prevent American conquest of the island. His goal was more limited: make the Americans pay such an appalling price that invasion of the home islands would seem too costly to contemplate, force them to recognize that every subsequent battle would cost more lives, more time, more resources. Create conditions where negotiated peace, preserving some Japanese territorial integrity, might seem preferable to the bloodbath an invasion would require. Ushijima's forces spent months transforming Okinawa's southern terrain into an elaborate fortress. They dug into hills and created defensive complexes and tunnels far more sophisticated than anything attempted on previous islands. Artillery positions were hidden in caves carved deep into rock, protected from American naval bombardment. Infantry positions were designed to defend one slope from surrounding hills, forcing Americans to clear every position individually. Machine guns and mortars were emplaced in locations requiring American attackers to expose themselves to interlocking fire from multiple directions. The defenses were masterful, utilizing terrain brilliantly, incorporating lessons from every previous island battle. Ushijima had approximately 110,000 troops, a force large enough to conduct a prolonged defense if supplied adequately. But adequate supply was impossible because American submarines and aircraft had severed Japanese logistics almost completely. Okinawa's defenders would fight with whatever supplies existed on the island when the battle began, plus whatever trickled through the American blockade. American forces landing on April 1st, 1945, encountered virtually no resistance on the beaches. The initial advance proceeded so smoothly that Admiral Raymond Spruance messaged Admiral Chester Nimitz, "I may be crazy, but it looks like the Japanese have quit the war, at least in this sector." Nimitz's response was terse and prophetic: "Delete all after crazy." The Americans advanced rapidly across the narrow waist of Okinawa, securing the northern portion of the island within weeks. But when they turned south and encountered Ushijima's prepared defenses, the battle transformed into the prolonged, bloody struggle Japanese planners had designed. For nearly 3 months, American forces fought yard by yard through defensive positions that extracted maximum casualties for minimal ground gained. Yet, even as Japanese forces fought with extraordinary courage and tactical skill, even as American casualties mounted to levels that shocked commanders accustomed to Pacific Island battles, the mathematical reality of American logistics made Japanese victory impossible from the first day. Yahida, serving as intelligence officer for the 32nd Army, watched the battle unfold with growing understanding that courage and skill meant nothing against overwhelming material superiority. The Americans never ran short of anything. Artillery ammunition arrived continuously. Troops were resupplied daily with fresh food, not emergency rations, but the same abundance American forces enjoyed everywhere. Wounded were evacuated efficiently to medical facilities, equipped better than most civilian hospitals in Japan. Vehicles were replaced as fast as they were destroyed. The American logistics system simply absorbed whatever damage Japanese forces inflicted and continued operating at the same overwhelming capacity. Yahida had prepared intelligence briefings for General Ushijima throughout the battle, tracking American capabilities, predicting movements, assessing vulnerabilities. Every briefing reached the same conclusion: American forces would advance methodically, accepting casualties, grinding down Japanese defenses through sheer material superiority. No tactical brilliance, no defensive preparation, no fighting spirit could overcome the fundamental disparity in logistics capacity. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By late May, as rain turned Okinawa's terrain into impassable mud and American advances slowed, Yahida briefly hoped that perhaps logistics limitations might force an American pause, creating an opportunity for counterattack. But American engineers simply built roads through the mud, laid corduroy paths of logs and metal, brought forward supplies despite conditions that would have paralyzed Japanese logistics completely. The rain that should have been a Japanese advantage became merely another problem. American abundance solved through overwhelming application of material resources. On June 22, 1945, organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa effectively ended. General Ushijima committed ritual suicide rather than surrender, following the code that demanded death before dishonor. His subordinate commanders followed his example. The defense had achieved its goal of making Americans pay heavily. More than 12,000 Americans died, the highest number lost in any single Pacific battle. Japanese losses exceeded 70,000 military personnel, plus perhaps 100,000 Okinawan civilians caught in the fighting. But the casualties, devastating as they were, changed nothing about the strategic situation. American forces secured Okinawa and immediately began transforming it into a massive forward base for invading Japan. Construction began within hours of the battle's end. Airfields were expanded, supply depots established, repair facilities constructed, all at speeds that demonstrated American logistics, operated on principles Japanese military science had never conceived possible. Yahida survived the battle because he was captured on June 21st, a day before Ushijima's suicide, when his headquarters position was overrun. He became one of the relatively few Japanese officers taken prisoner alive. The shame of surrender was profound, but survival meant he would finally understand with absolute clarity what he had spent years trying to deny. American material superiority was not propaganda or exaggeration. It was simple mathematical fact, verified through undeniable evidence, which brought him to this interrogation room on June 23rd, sitting across from Lieutenant Brennan, staring at American supply documents that quantified the impossibility of Japanese victory with bureaucratic precision. Brennan had laid out perhaps 20 different reports, each documenting some aspect of American logistics operations during the Okinawa campaign: fuel deliveries, ammunition expenditures, equipment replacements, food supplies, medical resources, construction materials. Every category told the same story. Americans operated at scales that made Japanese logistics look primitive. Yahida picked up another document almost at random. It recorded supplies delivered to American forces via the fleet train during the 3-month campaign. The table of numbers was clinical, each line representing a category of material: fuel oil, millions of barrels; aviation gasoline, millions of gallons; ammunition, thousands of tons; provisions, thousands of tons; general stores, thousands of tons; replacement aircraft, hundreds of planes. The totals exceeded what Japan's entire military had received during the same period from all sources combined. This was not national production. This was what one American naval logistics organization delivered to one battle theater during one campaign. Somewhere behind these numbers were factories producing this material, ships transporting it, bases storing it, systems managing it, all operating with efficiency and scale Japan had never achieved. Brennan watched Yahida study the documents in silence for several minutes. The lieutenant had conducted dozens of interrogations since Okinawa's surrender. Most Japanese officers refused to speak at all, maintaining silence as a final act of resistance. Some provided tactical information, but avoided broader strategic discussions. Few were willing to acknowledge the full extent of American superiority, because doing so meant admitting their entire war effort had been hopeless from the beginning. But Brennan recognized something different in Yahida's demeanor. This was not a defeated commander making excuses for failure. This was an intelligence professional finally confronting data he had spent years trying to analyze honestly, while his superiors demanded different conclusions. There was almost relief in Yahida's expression, the release that comes from acknowledging an unwelcome truth after years of denial. "How?" Yahida asked finally, breaking the silence that had stretched for minutes. His English was heavily accented but functional. "How is this possible? These numbers, they cannot be sustained. No nation's industry could produce this much material continuously." Brennan considered how to answer. He could cite American industrial statistics, describe the massive factory expansions, explain the logistics networks. But he suspected Yahida was asking something more fundamental, not how America produced so much, but how Japanese intelligence had so catastrophically underestimated American capacity. "Your intelligence services knew about our production capacity," Brennan said carefully. "We've captured Japanese reports analyzing American industrial output. The information was available. The question isn't how we did it. The question is why your leadership didn't believe it was possible." Yahida nodded slowly. That was indeed the question, and the answer revealed something profound about the nature of Japanese strategic planning. Japanese military culture had been built on centuries of tradition, emphasizing courage, discipline, and spiritual strength as the foundations of victory. Warriors with superior morale and training should defeat enemies with better equipment but weaker resolve. Material advantages should matter less than tactical skill and fighting spirit. These principles had worked throughout Japanese history, through wars fought with swords and muskets, through conflicts where numerical advantages could be overcome through better training and determination. But World War II was different from all previous conflicts. It was the first truly industrial total war, where victory depended more on factory output than battlefield prowess. The nation that could produce more tanks, planes, ships, ammunition, and supplies would win through mathematical attrition, regardless of tactical considerations. Japanese military leadership, trained in traditional methods, could not psychologically accept this new reality. They had seen American soldiers in peacetime, observed their casual attitudes, noted their dependence on mechanical devices for tasks Japanese soldiers accomplished through manual labor. The Americans seemed soft, undisciplined, unsuited for the hardships of war. Surely such an enemy would break under determined resistance, regardless of material advantages. But the Americans had not broken. They had absorbed every loss, sustained every casualty rate, maintained operational tempo without pause. And they had done so while simultaneously fighting a massive war in Europe, supporting allies worldwide, and maintaining industrial production that supplied multiple theaters. American capacity was so vast that the Pacific War received perhaps one-third of total American resources, yet still overwhelmed Japanese forces through sheer abundance. "We knew," Yahida said quietly, still staring at the supply documents. "Intelligence officers knew by 1943 that Japan could not win through military means. We prepared reports documenting American production superiority in every category. We showed that numerical advantages would increase over time. We calculated that by 1945, Japan would face Allied forces with 3-to-1 or 5-to-1 superiority in most combat categories." He paused, his hands now steady as he accepted what he was saying. Our reports were ignored. Leadership insisted that willpower would overcome numerical disadvantages, that American forces lacked fighting spirit, that tactical superiority could defeat industrial abundance. We provided facts. They chose to believe ideology instead. Brennan made notes but said nothing, letting Yahida continue at his own pace. "The truth was available," Yahida continued. "Every interrogated prisoner described your supply abundance. Every captured position contained more material than our units possessed. Every battle demonstrated your advantage. But acknowledging this truth meant acknowledging the war was hopeless, that we had launched a conflict we could never win, that our strategy was fundamentally flawed. No commander could accept this and continue fighting." The admission hung in the air between them. Yahida had just articulated what American intelligence analysts had long suspected. Japanese military leadership possessed accurate information about American capabilities, but chose to ignore evidence that contradicted their strategic assumptions. They had believed what they needed to believe to justify continued resistance, even when mathematics made victory impossible. "What was it like?" Brennan asked. "Knowing you would lose but fighting anyway?" Yahida considered the question for a long moment before answering. "We hoped something would change," he said finally. "A diplomatic breakthrough, war exhaustion in America, some technological development that would shift the balance. We knew the current trajectory led to defeat, but perhaps that trajectory would change, and even if it didn't, surrender was unthinkable. Better to fight with no hope of victory than to surrender without fighting. That was the code. He gestured at the supply documents spread across the table. But seeing these numbers makes clear what I denied for so long. There was no chance the trajectory would change. Your industrial capacity was so overwhelming that nothing short of your complete economic collapse could have shifted the balance. And you were growing stronger while we grew weaker. Every month, the gap widened. Every battle proved it. Yahida picked up one more document, this one showing American merchant shipping construction rates. The numbers revealed that America had built ships faster than German and Japanese submarines could sink them, producing enough excess capacity to supply every theater simultaneously, while replacing all losses. The mathematical certainty of American victory was written in these shipping statistics as clearly as in any battlefield result. You want to know the moment I truly understood Japan would lose? Yahida asked. It wasn't any single battle or report. It was sometime in mid-1944, analyzing patterns across multiple fronts. Everywhere Japanese forces engaged Americans, the same thing happened. You would establish beachheads despite our best defenses. Then you would simply overwhelm positions through firepower we couldn't match. Our troops fought courageously, killed many Americans, made you pay heavily for every advance. But you never stopped, never ran out of ammunition, never failed to evacuate wounded, never left positions undersupplied. He set down the document and looked directly at Brennan. The specific moment was reading a report from Saipan. An American Marine division on that island used more artillery ammunition in 1 month than all Japanese forces on all Pacific islands received during the same period. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that we had lost. Not that we were losing or might lose, that we had already lost. The outcome was determined by industrial capacity, and that battle was decided before the first shot was fired. Did you report this to your superiors? Brennan asked. Of course, Yahida said, multiple times, with documentation and analysis. I was not the only intelligence officer who understood. Many of us tried to provide realistic assessments, but our reports were dismissed as defeatism. Leadership wanted information that supported continued resistance, not analysis that suggested resistance was futile. Eventually, you learn to tell superiors what they want to hear rather than what evidence shows. The admission was damning, an acknowledgement that Japanese strategic planning had become divorced from reality, operating on wishful thinking rather than honest intelligence assessment. But Yahida's tone carried no bitterness, only the exhaustion of a professional who had tried to perform his duty honestly while knowing his analysis was being ignored. Okinawa was the final proof, he continued. Everything we predicted came true. American firepower was overwhelming. Your logistics never faltered. You absorbed casualties that should have forced you to pause and reorganize, but you simply replaced losses and continued advancing. Our best defenses, our most courageous fighters, our most advantageous terrain. Nothing mattered against your material superiority. Brennan studied the Japanese colonel carefully. Most interrogations followed predictable patterns. Officers provided minimal tactical information, maintained dignity through silence, or insisted on Japanese moral superiority despite defeat. Yahida was different. He was using this interrogation to finally speak truths he had been prevented from expressing for years. The American lieutenant recognized he was witnessing something rare and valuable, the honest assessment of an enemy intelligence professional freed by defeat to acknowledge what he had known but could not say during the war. Tell me about the planning discussions, Brennan prompted. When your staff analyzed American capabilities, what did commanders say when you presented evidence of their industrial advantage? Yahida closed his eyes briefly, remembering conferences that had occurred in bunkers and headquarters across the Pacific. Staff meetings where intelligence officers presented carefully documented analyses only to watch commanders dismiss evidence that contradicted strategic assumptions. They pointed to Japanese tactical victories, he said, to specific battles where we killed more Americans than we lost, to German successes in Europe that suggested industrial powers could be defeated through superior tactics. They cited historical examples of smaller forces, defeating larger ones through skill and determination. Hannibal's victories over Rome, Frederick the Great's campaigns, Napoleon's early wars. They insisted that courage and tactical excellence could overcome numerical disadvantages. He opened his eyes and looked at the supply documents again. What they failed to understand was that historical precedents did not apply to industrial warfare. Previous wars were fought between pre-industrial societies where tactical skill and individual courage were decisive. But when two industrial powers fight total war, the side with greater factory output wins through mathematical attrition. Courage becomes irrelevant when the enemy can fire 10 shells for every one you shoot. Tactical skill means nothing when you lack fuel to maneuver or ammunition to exploit advantages. Brennan made detailed notes. This was exactly the kind of strategic assessment American intelligence services wanted to document, understanding how Japanese commanders thought, what information they possessed, why they continued fighting despite knowing defeat was certain. These insights would prove valuable for future conflicts, for understanding how nations made strategic decisions under pressure. The supply situation was catastrophic, Yahida continued, apparently relieved to finally speak honestly after years of forced optimism. By 1944, Japanese logistics had essentially collapsed. Submarines and aircraft had severed our maritime supply routes. Islands that should have received regular resupply went months without deliveries. Troops survived on minimal rations. Ammunition was rationed so strictly that training became impossible. We told soldiers to make every shot count because there were no replacements. He picked up another American document, this one showing daily supply deliveries to forward bases on Okinawa. Meanwhile, Americans operated without any supply constraints whatsoever. You brought ice cream ships to the Pacific, ships whose entire purpose was producing frozen desserts for troops. When I first read intelligence reports about this, I assumed it was propaganda or mistaken identity. No military at war devotes shipping capacity to luxuries. But it was true. You had so much industrial capacity that you could afford to think about troop morale and comfort while we struggled to deliver rice and bullets. The ice cream ship detail was accurate. American forces had deployed concrete barges, refrigerated large, that could keep 64 carloads of frozen meats and 500 tons of fresh produce indefinitely at 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The vessels included ice machines and freezers producing more than 1 gallon of ice cream per minute. 3 such floating warehouses, costing over $1 million each, had been built specifically for tropical warfare. For Japanese officers learning about these vessels through intelligence reports, the ice cream ships represented something more significant than American wealth. They demonstrated a mindset that prioritized troop welfare even during total war. Japanese military culture emphasized endurance of hardship as building character and strengthening resolve. American culture apparently believed well-fed, comfortable troops fought more effectively than hungry, exhausted ones. Both philosophies were internally consistent, but only one was backed by the industrial capacity to implement it. What broke me psychologically, Yahida said quietly, was not the defeat itself. Warriors can accept defeat with honor if they fought courageously against overwhelming odds. What broke me was realizing the entire war was based on delusion, that we launched a conflict against an enemy with 10 times our industrial capacity, believing that spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage, that we sacrificed hundreds of thousands of lives in battles we knew could not change the strategic outcome, hoping something impossible would occur to save us. He paused, struggling with emotion that threatened his composure. I served the Emperor loyally. I performed my duties to the best of my ability, but I also spent years providing intelligence assessments that I knew were being ignored, watching decisions made based on ideology rather than facts, witnessing strategy built on hopes rather than realistic capabilities. And I could not speak honestly because doing so would be defeatism, would undermine morale, would dishonor my position. Brennan let the silence stretch, allowing Yahida time to compose himself. The interrogation had evolved beyond tactical intelligence gathering into something more profound. This was a professional soldier, confronting the moral weight of years, spent supporting a war he knew was hopeless, struggling with the question of whether honest intelligence assessment created a duty to oppose strategic decisions built on false assumptions. The mathematics were clear by early 1944. Yahida resumed after a moment. Japan had no path to military victory. Our only hope was that America would tire of fighting, would accept a negotiated peace that allowed us to retain some conquests. But this strategy required inflicting casualties at rates that would break American will. And even as we killed Americans in substantial numbers, your logistics never wavered, your supplies never decreased, your determination never weakened. He gestured at the documents showing American ammunition expenditures during Okinawa. We killed 12,000 Americans on Okinawa. By any previous war's standards, that should have been enough to cause serious reconsideration of strategy. But for America, 12,000 casualties was acceptable cost. You absorbed the losses and continued. You had already planned the next operation. You were building forces for invading Kyushu. Our victories, our sacrifices, our determination, none of it mattered because you could sustain losses indefinitely, while our capacity to resist diminished with every battle. Brennan asked the question he had been building toward throughout the interrogation. If Japanese intelligence knew by 1944 that military victory was impossible, why continue fighting for another year? Why not seek peace before Okinawa, before the firebombing of Japanese cities, before hundreds of thousands more died? Yahida's answer revealed the tragic logic that had prolonged the war months beyond any rational strategic purpose. Because seeking peace from a position of weakness would result in unconditional surrender, total occupation, possible elimination of the imperial system, loss of everything we had fought to preserve. Leadership believed that continued resistance, even without hope of victory, might create conditions for negotiated peace rather than surrender, that if we made invasion of Japan sufficiently costly, you might accept terms preserving the emperor and avoiding occupation. He shook his head slowly. It was fantasy. Of course, your stated policy was unconditional surrender. President Roosevelt had made that clear at Casablanca in 1943, but desperate people believe what they need to believe, and Japanese military culture made surrender unthinkable, even when resistance was pointless. Better to die fighting than to live with the shame of surrender. That code governed everything. The conversation was interrupted by another American officer entering with a box of additional captured documents. These were Japanese logistics reports from Okinawa, providing the counterpoint to American supply manifests. Brennan spread them on the table beside the American documents, creating a visual comparison that made the disparity undeniable. Japanese ammunition allocations for defending Okinawa showed monthly deliveries of perhaps 500 tons to all units. American ammunition expenditures showed consumption of thousands of tons monthly by individual divisions. Japanese fuel allocations were measured in hundreds of barrels. American fuel deliveries were measured in millions of barrels. Japanese food supplies were calculated to provide minimal rations. American provisions included fresh meat, vegetables, and frozen desserts. This is what defeat looks like, Yahida said, studying the comparison. Not tactical defeat on specific battlefields, but logistical defeat that makes tactical success meaningless. You won the war in factories and shipyards, not on beaches and ridges. Every battle simply demonstrated what industrial capacity had already determined. Brennan pulled out one more document, this one showing American production figures for the entire war. Aircraft, ships, tanks, trucks, weapons, ammunition. The totals were staggering, representing industrial mobilization on a scale unprecedented in human history. The United States had produced more than 300,000 aircraft during the war, more than all other nations combined. American shipyards had built more merchant tonnage in 4 months of 1943 than Japan constructed in 7 years. Liberty ship production had peaked at 3 ships completed per day. We knew most of these figures, Yahida said, examining the production statistics. Intelligence reports compiled data from multiple sources: agent networks, captured documents, analysis of equipment, serial numbers, aerial reconnaissance, prisoner interrogations. Every source confirmed American production vastly exceeded Japanese capacity. But knowing facts and accepting their implications are different things. He pointed to the aircraft production numbers. Japan produced approximately 76,000 military aircraft during the entire war. America produced more than 300,000. We knew this. Intelligence briefings included these figures. But commanders insisted Japanese planes were superior in quality, that our pilots were better trained, that our tactical doctrine was more advanced. And these things were true initially. Japanese Zero fighters outperformed American fighters early in the war. Our pilots had more experience. Our tactics were more sophisticated. He paused significantly. But quality differences become irrelevant when facing 5-to-1 numerical superiority. A superior aircraft flown by an expert pilot can defeat 2 or 3 inferior planes, but not 5 or 10. And unlike Japan, America continuously improved aircraft quality while increasing production. By 1944, American fighters matched or exceeded Japanese performance while being produced in overwhelming numbers. We lost the quality advantage and never had numerical advantage. At that point, defeat was inevitable. Pattern repeated across every category of military equipment. Japanese tanks were often superior to American designs in some technical specifications, but America built more than 88,000 tanks during the war, while Japan produced fewer than 10,000. Japanese destroyers were well-designed, effective warships, but America launched more than 800 anti-submarine vessels, while Japan built 63 destroyers. Japanese artillery was accurate and reliable, but America produced 43,000 artillery pieces in 1943 alone, 4 times Japan's total wartime production. The ship production figures were perhaps most devastating, Yahida said, examining American merchant shipping statistics. Japan's entire war strategy depended on controlling sea lanes to import raw materials from occupied territories: oil from the Dutch East Indies, rubber from Malaya, rice from Indochina. Our military could only function if maritime supply lines remained open. We understood this vulnerability and built submarine defenses accordingly. He looked up at Brennan with expression mixing admiration and despair. Then we discovered you were building merchant ships faster than our submarines could sink them. Not slightly faster, vastly faster. Liberty ships constructed in weeks. Shipyards producing multiple vessels simultaneously. At peak production, American yards completed 3 cargo ships per day. Our submarines would sink ships that were replaced within days. We were trying to drain the ocean with teaspoons while you filled it with fire hoses. The Liberty ship program represented American industrial capacity at its most impressive and incomprehensible to Japanese observers. Traditional shipbuilding was slow, methodical, requiring skilled craftsmen months or years to construct each vessel. Americans had revolutionized the process through mass production techniques never before applied to maritime construction. Prefabricated sections built simultaneously, then assembled like enormous building blocks, welding instead of riveting, standardized designs optimized for speed rather than elegance, assembly lines for ships. The results defied Japanese naval architecture understanding. The SS Robert E. Peary had been built in 4 days and 15.5 hours from keel laying to launch in November 1942. The SS Joseph N. Teal was built in 10 days in September 1942. These were exceptional records, publicity stunts with extensive prefabrication, but even routine Liberty ship production averaged 42 days from keel to launch. Japanese shipyards required 6 months minimum for comparable vessels. We calculated that destroying American maritime capacity required sinking ships faster than they could be built, Yahida explained. Our submarines achieved significant success in 1942, sinking hundreds of Allied ships. But your production increased faster than our sinking rates. By 1943, you were building ships 7 times faster than we could sink them. The Battle of the Atlantic was lost through arithmetic, not tactics. The same mathematical certainty that doomed German U-boat campaigns also defeated Japanese submarine strategy. Industrial capacity determined victory in modern naval warfare, not tactical skill or technological advantages. Nations that could build more ships faster would win maritime conflicts through simple replacement rates exceeding loss rates. Brennan reviewed his notes, recognizing he had documented something valuable. Most Japanese officers refused to discuss strategic assessments, maintaining the fiction that only bad luck or specific tactical failures caused defeat. Yahida was providing honest analysis, acknowledging that Japan had launched a war against an enemy with overwhelming industrial superiority, believing spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantage, and discovering too late that modern warfare was decided in factories rather than on battlefields. "What about the atomic bombs?" Brennan asked. "Did those change your assessment of how the war ended?" Yahida considered the question carefully. The atomic bombs provided justification for surrender that preserved some honor. Leadership could claim that these unprecedented weapons, not conventional defeat, forced capitulation. That without atomic bombs, Japan would have continued fighting despite conventional attacks. This narrative allowed surrender, while maintaining the fiction that only special circumstances made it necessary. He paused, choosing words precisely. But the truth is that Japan was already defeated before atomic bombs were used. The blockade had severed all maritime trade. Strategic bombing had devastated industrial capacity. The Soviet Union's entry into the war eliminated any hope of negotiated peace. Japanese forces had been pushed back to the home islands. American forces were preparing for invasion. The atomic bombs simply provided the final proof that continued resistance was pointless and gave leadership an excuse to accept what was already inevitable. This assessment aligned with American intelligence analysis. Japan's military situation in August 1945 was hopeless even without atomic weapons. The question was not whether Japan would be defeated, but how long defeat would take and how many casualties would occur during the final battles. Atomic bombs compressed the timeline and potentially avoided the massive casualties that invasion would have caused on both sides. The industrial disparity made our defeat certain from December 1941, Yahida continued. Every subsequent battle just demonstrated what production figures had already determined. We needed some miracle to change the fundamental economic balance, a diplomatic breakthrough that brought America's enemies together against it, a technological development that rendered American production irrelevant, a complete American economic collapse. None of these occurred. Instead, America grew stronger while we grew weaker. Every month widened the gap. He gathered the American supply documents into a neat stack, handling them with care as if they were historical artifacts requiring preservation. I spent 4 years tracking American capabilities, compiling reports, analyzing data. I knew by 1943 that military victory was impossible. I knew by 1944 that even defensive success was unlikely. I knew by 1945 that surrender was inevitable. But I could not say these things openly because doing so would be defeatism. So I provided facts and let others draw conclusions they preferred, rather than conclusions evidence supported. The admission contained profound moral weight. Yahida had been a professional intelligence officer performing his duties accurately, but within a system that punished honest assessments contradicting strategic assumptions. He had known the war was hopeless, but participated in its continuation because his culture and position offered no alternative to continued service. "What will you tell your family?" Brennan asked. "About why Japan lost?" Yahida's response came without hesitation, that we fought courageously but were defeated by an enemy with 10 times our industrial capacity, that our soldiers and sailors performed their duties honorably, that we lost not through moral failure or tactical inadequacy, but through mathematical certainty. That courage cannot overcome arithmetic when fighting industrial total war, that we believed what we needed to believe, rather than what evidence showed, and paid a terrible price for that delusion. He stood slowly, formal even in defeat, acknowledging the interrogation was complete. "May I make one request?" he asked. "What is it?" "Preserve these documents," Yahida said, gesturing at the supply manifests and logistics reports spread across the table. Make sure future generations understand that Japan lost not because Japanese people lacked courage or determination, but because we launched a war against an enemy with overwhelming industrial superiority. Make sure the lesson is clear. Modern warfare between industrial powers is decided by production capacity, not battlefield heroics. Any nation that forgets this lesson will repeat our mistakes. Brennan agreed, recognizing the historical value of Yahida's assessment. The interrogation had produced not just tactical intelligence but strategic understanding of how Japan made decisions during the war, what information Japanese leaders possessed, why they continued fighting despite knowing victory was impossible. This documentation would prove valuable for decades to come, as historians tried to understand the Pacific War. 2 military police officers arrived to escort Yahida back to the prisoner holding area. As he reached the door, the Japanese colonel turned back for a final observation. "The captured American supply charts you showed me today," he said. "They prove what I spent years trying to deny. Your logistics moved 12,000 tons daily across the Pacific during routine operations. Japan's entire military received less than that from all sources combined. That single statistic explains everything. We were not defeated by your tactics or your courage or your technology. We were defeated by your factories. The war was decided before it began, and we were simply too proud or too deluded to acknowledge mathematical reality." He bowed formally, a gesture of respect between military professionals despite being on opposite sides of history's most devastating conflict. "Arithmetic always wins," he said quietly. "That is the lesson of this war. Arithmetic always wins." After Yahida left the interrogation room, Brennan sat alone for several minutes, organizing his notes and considering what he had documented. The interrogation had provided remarkable insights into Japanese strategic thinking, confirming what American intelligence had suspected but never fully understood. Japanese military leaders possessed accurate information about American industrial capacity, but chose to believe that tactical excellence and spiritual strength would overcome material disadvantages. This was not simple incompetence or failure to gather intelligence. Japanese intelligence services had performed competently, collecting data from multiple sources, analyzing production figures, assessing American capabilities. The failure occurred at the strategic level, where leadership rejected intelligence assessments that contradicted core assumptions about warfare. They believed what military tradition and cultural values suggested should be true, rather than what evidence demonstrated was true. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.